The Fantasy Fullback Dive is thrilled to welcome on for the first time Pat Fitzmaurice, the lead fantasy expert over at The Football Girl, also has a gem podcast, Fitz on Fantasy, and I'm just excited to pick his brain. We've been chatting for a few minutes. He's been very patient as we get this all together. It's been just a pleasure already meeting him, so I can't wait to just chat fantasy with him here over some coffee. Thank you so much for joining today, Pat.
My man, the Wolf, how are you? It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure's all mine, and I'm doing fantastic. It's actually my second day of summer vacation. We were just kind of catching up, and it's nice to kind of have these months to go full bore into the fantasy game, take a little mental break. So I'm thrilled right now. Everything is great. Not that I don't love teaching, but it is nice to have those time off. You got any good summer planned? I mean, it's a crazy time we're living in, but you got anything lined up for your summer?
Yeah, hopefully just a lot of golf.
Yeah.
A little less staring over my kid's shoulder at what they're doing with their Zoom learning for school and now summer school for a couple of weeks. So just hopefully getting out and enjoying the nice weather, since here in the upper Midwest we only get 3 or 4 months of it a year. But I do like how things for the teachers like you, and I know there are a lot of teachers in the fantasy community, how things time out so perfectly where you really get to dive into the studies and the prep for the season ahead when you have a little extra downtime in the summer. So that's nice for you guys.
Oh yeah, it works out so perfectly. What grades are your kids in?
One is going to be a freshman in high school and one is going to be in 8th grade. They're just one grade apart. So
wow, nice.
Yeah. So it's interesting times for sure. And, my daughter's not too crushed that 8th grade didn't finish quite the way she would have liked with the conventional graduation and all that. I feel bad for the high school and college seniors who didn't get to go out the way they wanted to. But hopefully we'll be on track again soon.
Absolutely. I know losing their senior sports seasons or things like that. It's tough. So, yeah, same here. You did the car graduation parades and things like that, but obviously not quite the same. So yeah, they're all taking it so well in stride, though. A great group over where I teach, at least. So it's tough though, totally. But it is summer, so there are more positive times ahead, at least. And I'd love to just get a little bit more information on you before we dive into the focus of today's show. We're going to focus on best ball, which we'll talk about what it is, some roster construction, what players you target, what kind of guys I like to look at in best ball. But I love, before we dive into the feature segments, to learn a little bit more about the Wolves we're bringing in. And we've had a really good slate of guests, so I'm thrilled you're able to kind of keep the ball rolling here. And the question I love to ask everybody before we get going is, what's kind of your path been into this fantasy industry? How and when did you get involved? And do you have any advice for, I'm fairly new and others trying to break into the space. What would be your advice to us?
Sure. I'll try to give the shorter version of my story, I guess. I got into football. I'm kind of an old timer. I got into fantasy football like a friend in college in the early 90s. Got me into it, and it was just like a 1 year or a 1 week pool kind of thing where we drafted our teams, and it was just winner take all with the high total every week. And I think my team was terrible, and I thought the whole thing was kind of stupid until I rattled off a couple of wins late in the season, and all of a sudden I got hooked on it. And started forming formed a conventional fantasy league with some buddies the following year. And, before long we were all just completely hooked and obsessed with it and talked about nothing else when we were together. And, just continued to be in that. Like, fantasy football was not a hard sell for a lifelong sports junkie. And then, I'm sort of in the media, the print media, field, and in late 1997 I got hired by Pro Football Weekly to be an editor for them. And really maybe only like 20% of the job was fantasy, but it was certainly easier to get deeper into fantasy. And now I'm starting to write about it a little and do mock drafts with my fellow editors and playing leagues with them. So now I'm getting really hooked, starting to get into the content creation field. Left Pro Football Weekly after only 2.5 years, but left on real good terms, and they invited me to keep contributing to their fantasy coverage on their website as a freelancer, and I took them up on that offer and continued to do that for about 15, 16 years until they shut down, and then, landed with the football girl, Melissa Jacobs, the owner and operator of that website, had gotten to be kind of a Twitter buddy of mine. And so I have parked my fantasy content over there for a while and launched this podcast 2 years, I think it is. 2 years? Yeah, 2 years ago. And that's about it. As far as advice, I mean, I do think it really helps to work on your writing. Like, obviously that matters if you're writing fantasy articles that you want people to read. No one wants to read the work of someone who can't put together clean, coherent sentences. But even if you're not writing articles, maybe you're doing a podcast or you're just doing like heavy data mining and you're mostly a chart and graph kind of person, that's cool. But I mean, I think it still helps to have the writing skills to be able to express yourself well on Twitter. And I don't know, more specifically, I think everyone should own a very small but essential book called The Elements of Style. It's the best manual for writing that's ever been written, and reading it will instantly improve your writing.
Absolutely. Is that Stunk? What's the guy's name? Stunk or something like that? Strunk or Struck? Yeah. I read that one in college. I was an English major myself. I love that recommendation. It's so clear cut in the way he uses the things he's teaching. I love that book. It's a fantastic recommendation. This one's a little bit off script, but you were talking about how you first started and you weren't all that into it, and then you started to kind of build some steam. Was there... I feel like a lot of times people get into fantasy and there's like one player who just like their first season sticks out as the guy that like swung their team, got them hooked. Is there anybody that kind of comes to mind from your first season of playing that just hooked you into the game?
Absolutely. So I was a total doormat for most of that season, and it was the Stephon Page, obscure old wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs, who had a phenomenal Monday night game that put me over the top one week, and that propelled me to like my first victory, my first payouts. And when you're a broke college student, getting a nice little payout like that is that'll winning a lump sum it'll perk your interest quite a bit. So he was one guy I have to give credit to, I guess. I should add one more thing on the advice front. I mean, you don't need an invitation to start putting out content. Like, if you want to write, start a blog. If you want to have a podcast, start a podcast. Just get on Twitter, follow as many fantasy football people as you can, start interacting with people in a respectful, non-pushy way. And, when you start putting out content, use Twitter to promote it. So you don't have to wait around to be asked to contribute. That's the nice thing about it.
Absolutely. I think that's huge advice. It's kind of how I'm getting going in this game. It's been about 3 or 4 years. And I've always loved fantasy. I've always liked to write. And I just, during like a February vacation as a teacher, started just writing random stuff. And you don't know exactly where it will go or where you'll land, but people started to pay attention. As you said, interacting respectfully. Scott Barrett, one of the industry's biggest guys out there, would always put out these weekly sit starts. And this is when I had, maybe 100, 200 followers at most. And I would just comment on them because he'd get, obviously Barrett's huge. You get a million questions a week, and I would just answer them. And people started kind of following me from that. Randomly, Barrett just kind of DM'd me one day and was like, "Hey man, I really appreciate you commenting and answering all these since I don't really have the time for it. If you'd ever want me to come on a pod, I would." And then that just kind of snowballed. I had Barrett on, which kind of gave me some credibility to have other guests. And not that I'm, it's certainly not huge or anything yet, but like you're saying, if you don't get started, it will never happen. You just never know where it's going to go. So I love that advice. It's what I took for myself, and it's still rolling, and who knows where it will go. So I really appreciate you sharing that with our listeners. In terms of your fantasy process, now that you've kind of been in the game and doing it, I mean, you started in the 90s, so you've been going for a while. I don't know if your process has changed or evolved since when you first started, but there's obviously, now there's tons of analytics, there's tons of film, and there's a little bit of debate between both. So I don't know if you have kind of like an overview of your process. Has it evolved since you first started, or what do you do to prepare for a season?
I think the difference now versus when I first started was that I just get a much earlier jump on it. Every year I do my first set of redraft rankings in late January or early February while the playoffs are still actually going on. I just want the most recent season kind of fresh in my head as far as how well or how poorly players were performing. And I feel like if I don't do those very early rankings and just wait until after the draft and free agency, then I'm going to wind up letting player performance get completely overshadowed by depth charts and early perceptions of what playing time is going to look like. And I mean, so often those early perceptions are faulty in the spring and early summer, right?
Right.
So, getting the early jump on it is kind of important to me. And then, like, just through, my own research when I'm doing articles and rankings, and also through, I follow, hundreds of fantasy people on Twitter. So it's like I'm constantly being bombarded with ideas and opinions. And, I see all these things, and some I find really fascinating and compelling, and others I just completely reject out of hand. But, that all of that does kind of change the way that maybe I looked at things on that first pass at rankings. So, it's just kind of evolving, I guess, and necessarily like specific steps I go through, but like get those first rankings down and then just kind of start looking through things. But like,
yeah, no, I totally agree, man.
Talking about like the marriage of analytics. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. It cut out for just a second. Want to keep diving back into what you were saying between the marriage of analytics and film. We just had a quick dead spot that hit there, but keep on rolling, and I'll comment on it all. I wrote down a couple notes. I love everything you're saying. Keep rolling with what you were going. Sorry about that dead spot there.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to say that, there's always this analytics versus film debate.
Right.
And I really think it has to be both. Analytics can kind of clear the fog on a lot of things and help us evaluate players and point the way toward optimal strategies. But I also think you have to have a good handle on the player pool. And it's impossible to do that without actually watching football. We like to use the word film, but that's kind of silly, right? We're not sitting in a room with a projector and a bunch of film canisters.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there's some guys who do this full time and they'll grind through games and watch the all 22 tape. Personally, I'm not one of those guys. I'm just someone who watches a ton of football. The TV's on all day Sunday, and it's often on the DirecTV channel with multiple screens showing every game at once. I watch the Thursday night game, the Monday night game. Now that my kids are older and don't need as much managing, I'm back to watching a boatload of college football games every Saturday. But yeah, back to the point. I mean, I think film and analytics can live together in sort of a happy marriage. It shouldn't be either or. But I kind of start with, the player evaluation in that first set of rankings, and then I'll kind of let some of the analytics and the numbers massage my feelings about players, I guess.
I think me and you approach everything very similarly, if not the exact same. Like right when the Super Bowl ends, I always, no matter if I'm hungover the next day, whatever it is after the game, I just love to just bury it all out and make a set of rankings no matter what. And I call that kind of my stream of gut. Like there's nothing that can distract me. There's no tweets yet. There's no analysis that's been out there. It's literally purely my gut. And of course, when players change teams or new coaches come in or whatever you have, the rookies, those are obviously going to change. But it is interesting to look back and then be like, okay, so this guy didn't have a whole lot around him change, and I was ranking him significantly lower than what's coming out right now. Like, was I wrong? Do I need to reevaluate? And that's when, as you said, the analytics and the things that I'm noticing, is there a different usage trend? Whatever it might be. I love that idea of just pouring it all out like right away and then maybe storing it away. Even if you don't look at it, you take a mental break. I personally can't because I'm just so addicted to football. I have to like constantly be reading everything about it. But I love that idea of just getting it all out and then letting the kind of I love the description too, the analytics massage the film. Like I'm the same type of way. I love watching it. I got into it because I just love football. I'm not totally into the analytics, but then if there's these pieces of evidence that are kind of perfectly suggesting what you see in tape or projecting what might happen in the future, you're just at a disadvantage to not use them either. So interesting way to describe it. I really like that. That's awesome. In terms of like tools or different things, there's so much out there now as the game evolves and gains steam. So many interesting sites pumping out different ways to mock draft or analyze projections or look at game splits and all these different things. Do you have any tools for our listeners that you would, you consider kind of a game changer that you regularly utilize, or are you more kind of bread and butter? What are some things that you use to prepare?
I mean, I'll just throw out a couple of examples. And, one is maybe like more at a player level where, I mean, yards per route run is a metric I've been leaning on a little more in the last year or two. And I think people have come to sort of recognize that it can be a pretty useful metric just because it sort of filters out pure volume and can sometimes shine light on wide receivers and maybe tight ends who aren't getting full-time snaps and just show that they're doing a lot with the time that they are getting. And then during the season, for instance, when I'm looking at matchups for quarterbacks, like if you're looking at how teams are rated, opposing defenses against the pass, those are usually rated in order of yards allowed, which can be sort of misleading. I mean, a team like the Chiefs are probably never going to be among the best in terms of yards allowed in the passing game because they have such a powerful offense and opponents usually have to throw a lot to try to keep up. But that doesn't mean the Chiefs have a bad pass defense just because they're giving up maybe the most passing yards in the league. So like during the season when I'm trying to look at quarterbacks for the following week, I tend to look at opponent passer rating as a much more true indication of how good a team plays pass defense. And I know some people think passer rating is kind of flawed and, you know, QBR was devised as an answer to that. I'm not sure QBR is any better, to be honest. But I found opponent passer rating kind of helps as that goes. So that's just an example. I mean, there's so many metrics we can point to as being helpful. And I think sometimes, depending on the player, one metric might be more truthful than another. And for another player, the other metric might be more truthful. You know, it kind of depends sometimes. Like, it's not immediately clear what's great and what's accurate in gauging a player's value and what's kind of noisy. Right. But that metric for a given player might sort of change depending on who it is. I know that's kind of a weird answer, but for noisy stats, I mean, I guess the obvious one would be yards per carry or yards per catch, especially yards per carry. Like just a couple years ago, I mean, there were some people who thought Melvin Gordon wasn't good because he was consistently failing to average 4 yards a carry with the Chargers. But yeah, I mean, running behind a really bad offensive line will do that. So, like, to me, I mean, there was never any doubt that Melvin Gordon was good, but, you know, some people would look at that YPC and be like, hey, do we really know if Melvin Gordon's good?
Exactly. And then you look at his yards after contact and it's towards the top of the league every single year. Right, so it's like, you know, you got to figure out which metric is it that's truly. I love the ones that you pointed out for efficiency, yards per route run, because maybe if we can project that person that was just killing it for a larger role in the next season for whatever reason, if somebody left and there's a depth chart dissension or they're going to spread it out more or what have you, those are the metrics. I love the ones you highlighted that emphasize the player's talent, even if we can't get a full grip on their usage. In fact, that's kind of leading me, I'm jumping a little all over the place, but the question I like to ask analysts is like, do they ever come up with a formula for fantasy success, whether that's the individual talent, whether that's the usage, whether that's the team? Like, is there any type of weight you kind of look at more so than other indicators? You know, if it's the stock market, right? Like indicators for the stock, is there things that you definitely weigh higher than others, or how do you kind of approach your player evaluations?
Yeah, I mean, generally, especially at the non-quarterback positions, I guess it's probably usage times talent, or talent times usage, I guess, because and it would have to be times rather than plus, because, you know, without usage, it's it's going to be at zero. So yeah, I mean, like, it's important to know the depth charts and the opportunity someone might have, you know, because without that opportunity, it's hard for them to show off the talent. But I also think sometimes we tend to over rely on depth charts for our rankings and just, you know, making assumptions about how things are going to shake out as far as playing time. And, you know, we're basically pretty bad at making those types of projections, I think. So, you know, it is good to have some sort of handle on the player pool and the true talent of these guys, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. And the last question I have before we dig into the meat here of the segment is, do you have any other analysts, like whether they're the under-the-radar gems or kind of established big names, just the guys that you really consider like the wolves that you go to that, just in case our listeners, for whatever reason, haven't heard of, who are some guys that you really look to as like a wolf or an analyst you really respect in the industry?
All right. I mean, I could name so many guys. I mean, they're just like dozens, if not hundreds of guys I respect who have like opened my eyes to new things and who, I just enjoy consuming their content or feel like, I learn a lot whenever I talk to them or read their stuff. I mean, two who sort of come to mind, and like, I feel like I'm going to give short shrift to anyone I don't mention. Like you talked about Scott Barrett. I mean, Scott's been on my podcast a couple times. He's just, such a sharp dude.
It's an awesome episode, by the way. I listened to that one yesterday, but just to kind of like get a feel for how you guys do your shows, and it was awesome.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, just to give that a pump. Fantasy on Fitz was that one with the upside conversation. Is that the one you're referring to? So good.
Yeah. Scott is a sharp guy, and he had just rolled out his series on looking at the importance of upside and just So obviously he's a guy like that. He's the one guy who most resonates with me out of all the fantasy people, and he's not really an under the radar guy, is Rich Hribar. Rich's last name Hribar. He is just, I think it's the way he looks at things that he just like has this I think he sees the game in ways that other people don't, just like not losing sight of the fact that we are playing a game. Like how do you play to win this game? He has interesting views on players. When I talked to him, like on my podcast a few weeks ago, he had a really interesting observation about Lamar Jackson. This is just a one example where he, points out that last year Lamar Jackson was very affordable. A lot of people in the fantasy community kind of saw him coming. So he was a sharp pick last summer that a lot of the sharp people were on, and it was kind of no surprise that he turned a big profit for the people who invested in him. But now that the investment level has gone up so much, the price is so much steeper, then the natural reaction from the fantasy community is going to be to pull back a little and sort of let the public have a lot of Lamar Jackson. I know I don't want to be too condescending in saying the public, but like, the home leaguers who don't start really digging in on the research until, July. But Rich also pointed out that Baltimore basically had its way last year as far as how the season went. Like everything went great. After the first few weeks, their defense just turned into a monster, and game script was going their way all season, and yet Lamar was still putting up these crazy numbers. But then in the playoffs, we saw things totally go sideways for them against the Titans, and all of a sudden they're playing from behind, and Lamar is playing with his hair on fire. And even though they lost that game, Lamar ends up with like crazy passing numbers, over 300 yards, multiple touchdowns. Add that to 100 plus rushing yards. He just put up this sick 40 something fantasy point total. And, what if things don't go as smoothly for Baltimore this year? What if there's some sort of pullback and Lamar has 3 or 4 of those games where he goes so berserk that no matter who your opponent is playing, you're pretty much winning that week. Like if he has a handful of those week and wins you 3 or 4 games single-handedly, I mean, maybe he is worth the late second, early third round price. So Rich is a guy who kind of, I don't know, he can kind of see through the fog sometimes. And I always enjoy his approach and some of the things he comes up with and ways to think about things. So yeah, he would be pretty high on my list.
Absolutely. That's a very interesting take too, because obviously the whole industry expectations wait on quarterback, and the argument behind it is so valid. The opportunity cost, the supply and demand, it makes sense. And I've always been a wait on QB guy. I think this year with the depth at wide receiver, if you're not going, running back early and stockpiling bell cows, this might be the year to shoot for that week winning style edge that Lamar Jackson brings. That's such an interesting, take to veer from it. I personally, in my main league, my hometown buddies that I've been in forever, I had the distinct pleasure of facing Lamar Jackson not once or twice, but 3 times last year. Week 1, and then that was that kind of opponent you see right before the end of the season. And then I met that guy in the semifinals of the playoffs. Every time I faced him, he scored 35 or more fantasy points. And and that guy ended up winning the league too. But I had no shot no matter what. And that's the type of guy he brings. So if he's fallen to late round 2, you have Christian McCaffrey already on your team or one of these locked in kind of bell cows. Why not get that shot at, like you said, it's going to be probably 20 points no matter what, and very often going to hit that 30 to even 40 point insanity. So Rich is a great one to toss out like that. I'm definitely going to hope to have him on this too, to do this segment with him, because he definitely, I love it, just sees the game in a different way. It's a fantastic way to put it. So thank you for shouting him out. And if any of you guys don't follow Rich or Pat, that's paying attention right now, be sure to follow both of those guys on Facebook. Pat, before we dig into the best ball, do you mind just kind of pumping real quick where our listeners can find you and see some of your content?
Oh, sure. Place to start, I guess, is on Twitter, where you can find me at Fitz_FF. And my written content, including my rankings, is always parked at thefootballgirl.com. Obviously, I am not the football girl, but my colleague Melissa Jacobs runs that site and allows me to park all my fantasy stuff there. And then, if you search for Fitz on Fantasy, you will find my podcast, which is on most of the major platforms, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud. So, hopefully that's an hour that's worth your listening time every week.
It absolutely is. Yeah. Keep going. Sorry, but I did want to say, as soon as I found the podcast through you, I've been listening weekly, and it's every guest you have. The interviews are always fantastic. Sorry to interrupt
thanks,
you.
Brother. No, you didn't at all. I was just going to, thanks for that. And no, thank you for giving me the chance to, pitch my content. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. And we appreciate you being on here, especially now. We're going to dive into the feature here of best ball. So obviously it's, mid-June to late June right now. These ADPs are going to change, especially if and when training camp hits and we get reports or if injuries happen. So it's not like if somebody finds this episode in August, it's exactly reflective of the market we're going to be playing with. But still, there's definitely approaches to, first of all, what is best ball, and then how do you construct a roster? And some of these player values, most of them are fairly locked in at this point. So I think we can really paint a good picture of who to target, when to target, who to avoid, and things like that, especially within this specific setting. Before we kind of go into the specific players, what is best ball for any of our listeners who may not play it right now? Could you kind of give us a quick summary of how it works?
Yeah, so there are sites that open up draft rooms basically in February, pretty, soon after the Super Bowl ends. They are opening their draft rooms for the following season. And best ball is nice because you draft your team and then you forget it. You don't have to, people love draft. Like, that's the most fun thing about fantasy football, right? Managing our teams in season is fun too, but it can also be time consuming if you're managing multiple teams. So with best ball, there are no ad drops. There are no lineups to be set every week. You get your highest scores at every position every week. You get your single highest scoring quarterback, your 2 highest scoring running backs, 3 highest scoring receivers, 1 highest scoring tight end, and highest scoring team defense, and I think highest scoring flex. And in best ball, you typically, I don't know, in fan ball, it's 20 spots, in NFFC and some of these other sites, they're different rosters. Some are more like 28 guys per team. Mm-hmm. In either case, you get your best scoring guys every week. So sometimes that kind of changes the guys you're going after. You're chasing ceiling a little bit more than floor. So that's the gist of it. It's really a lot of fun. And yeah, man, I've pretty much had at least 1 or 2 best ball drafts in the air ever since like late February, early March, I think.
Love it.
Even before the NFL draft. Yeah, they're a blast.
It is so nice to not have to draft, as you said. The funnest part of fantasy truly is draft day is always the best, but to be able to do that and then not have to deal with the headaches of league management and trades and fantasy picks. And again, we all love that stuff. It's great to have that, but when you do so many leagues, it can start to feel like a headache. So to have that thrill of drafting and not the management is a huge plus to it. You've already kind of hinted at, you want to start targeting ceiling because it auto picks the people in your lineup. What are some other kind of specific philosophies or methods you have to roster construction, if any?
Yeah, so I generally do the fan ball draft.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to have a pretty specific construction. Like I'll go almost always 2 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, 7 receivers, 2 tight ends, and 3 defenses. And the defense thing is kind of, I don't know, most people I think draft 2. I draft 3 just because I want to maximize my upside chances. And like those are always my last 3 picks. And that leaves me with 1 spot left over that I will put at, whatever position I consider to be my weakest usually. Although I tend not to do it at quarterback. So it's often a tight end. If I'm kind of waiting on tight end, I'll take a third guy, or maybe I kind of got the left out on some of the top running backs, and maybe I'll add a running back, or maybe I'll take another receiver. But I think early on, I'm generally trying to really hammer the running back and wide receiver positions early on. Just because you've got to start multiple guys every week. I mean, especially receiver, having to do at least 3, plus you can have a flex there. Like, you really want to build a pretty deep basket of wide receivers and kind of hammer those guys early and often.
Absolutely, yeah. I tend to, and I'm still pretty new to the best ball game, but it's very similar to what you say. I love to hammer running back, receiver early, particularly running backs very early in the draft. And I'm not sure if you have like a position you target at various stages. For me, and who knows how successful, we'll see how it goes. I feel like the running back pool kind of shallows out from those like true bell cow upside, the guys that might have 20 to 25 touch upside, especially in high potent offenses. By mid round, by the end of round 2, and sometimes they trickle into round 3 if Melvin Gordon or people like that fall there. So I try to hammer running back pretty early, and then I just load up on those high upside receivers like you're saying that could just boom and have 30-point days that I might not have started. They might have been the headache on my bench, and I always bench them in the wrong weeks and always play them in the wrong times too. So it could be those guys. They finally are your flexes at the right time, which is nice as well. So loading up on a bunch of those. Do you have like I was saying, I go running back early, receivers. Does it depend on your draft slot, or do you tend to target different types of players and positions at different stages, whether early, middle, or late?
It does to some degree depend on draft slot, but I totally agree with you, Wolf. Like this year in particular, just the way it shakes out, it seems like a running back start makes a lot of sense, just because, it's nice to get, if you can get Michael Thomas or Devontae Adams, sure. Like if those guys would be slipping into the second round, Michael Thomas is never slipping into the second round. Never. Devontae Adams is almost never slipping into the second round. It's just, it's kind of easier it feels like you're walking downhill the rest of the draft if you start with those 2 good running backs. You don't feel as obligated to reach for guys later in the draft, because it seems like a lot of the running backs you're taking in the 6th, 7th, 8th round feel kind of gross at the round you're taking them. Like, taking Ronald Jones in the 7th round, or Tevin Coleman in the 7th round, or even Darius Geis in like the early 6th or something like that. Those don't feel like real confident picks. And meanwhile, some of the running backs or wide receivers you can get in the 6th, 7th, and 8th round are really attractive guys.
Right.
When you can get Jarvis Landry in the 6th round, when you can get Terry McLaurin late in the 5th round, or something like that. I think, the tides definitely sort of are with you when you hit running back early and then start hammering wide receivers for, you know, third through sixth or fourth through seventh rounds. Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm with you. That's kind of been my build too. And then just getting back to roster construction, like the middle rounds, that's a good time to hit your tight ends and your quarterbacks, I think. Like, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's nice to have Travis Kelce or George Kittle. Obviously, you're making a sacrifice at running back and wide receiver to do that. So I tend to shot more at the Jonnu Smith, TJ Hawkinson type level. And, you know, you can always find some pretty interesting tight end prospects in the middle rounds, along with like the bulk of the late QB1 types, the Carson Wentzes, the Matt Ryans. So yeah, that's kind of how you should spend your middle rounds, I think, for the most part.
Absolutely, yeah. I know we keep highlighting the depth at receiver, but tight end, some of those names you just tossed out, Jonnu Smith, TJ Hawkinson, don't go till tight end 20. And there's 20 tight ends with huge weekly upside. That's also a pretty deep pool for a position that's a onesie position, and also has typically been so shallow. And who knows if there will actually be consistency. It's been tough to find more than 6 to 7 yearly consistently guys. But I guess in best ball, you know, that's not about necessarily having that steady guy you know is going to be reliable every week. It's 2 to 3 explosive guys late that, hey, this one blew up one week, this guy disappeared, but it doesn't matter because the best one is in my lineup. So I'm fully aboard the roster construction that you're suggesting and the when and where to target players. We're going to dive into specific players in 1 second. I just wanted to shout out this article because, I'm pretty new to best ball, but I was reading up yesterday just to make sure I didn't sound like a buffoon on this podcast. And there's an article on 4for4, another one of my favorite fantasy sites out there. And it's a great one about the roster construction of the most winning FFPC, one of the bigger best ball tournaments, roster construction from last year. And the top one, the 10.8% win rate, had 3 quarterbacks, 7 running backs, 8 receivers, 4 tight ends, 3 defenses. So that was just to shout out what was the actual science behind it. That was the main winning lineup. Of course, there's other ways you can go about it. It was only a 10.8%. But hey, any edge out there we'll take. But now diving into those specific, you've kind of given us the positions you target, the order, and you've tossed out a few names that I love. Let's start going into the round, you know, the stages of the draft and talking about who you really hope to land. I guess we can start with early. It's a little bit different. That's where draft slot definitely, you know, takes a toll and you're kind of dictated who's there to you. But is there any players you're really hoping to leave those early rounds with in your best ball leagues?
Yeah, so I think the first and second rounds are largely dictated by draft order, and like I don't think my wish list really is that different from people's most other people's in terms of like the first 2 rounds. You know, I'm targeting McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley with those first 2 picks. If I'm toward the middle of the round, I maybe think about like Joe Mixon or I don't know. As it gets later in the round, maybe, hoping to maybe get some Nick Chubb, Aaron Jones type combination on the turn. Like, I don't think any of that changes. I think the third round is where things kind of get interesting. And depending on where I am, like when I finally want to break out of the running back, off the running back track after I've got my 2 guys in there. I mean, the 2 receivers who I like a lot, who seem to be available in the mid-third or later, Kenny Golladay and Allen Robinson, just because I think for some people they're more like wide receiver 2 types, but I really think they're pretty legitimate wide receiver 1 types, maybe back end wide receiver 1s. Allen Robinson is just clearly the guy in Chicago, and maybe it scares off some people that he doesn't have a great quarterback that he's playing with, but he was able to put up really impressive numbers last year playing with Mitch Trubisky. So that says quite a bit about him. And Kenny Golladay is certainly a guy who just, I mean, seeing is believing with him. He's just so good. And, the fact that he was able to consistently score touchdowns last year with David Blau as his quarterback, who, a guy I'm kind of shocked has been able to stick in the NFL. Yeah, I mean, Galladay's just phenomenal. And even though a lot of people like Marvin Jones, and Marvin Jones is a quality number 2, like Galladay is clearly the alpha receiver in Detroit. So those 2 guys, and one more guy, like I really like. I think some people think the mid to late 3rd round is too early for him, and he does get into the 4th round in some leagues, but I love Jonathan Taylor. I think he's the best running back prospect we've seen since Saquon Barkley.
Wow.
The size-speed combination, and I am a little biased here because I am a Wisconsin guy, but his footwork is just amazing. He started to catch passes more in his last season when he, asked the coaching staff to involve him in the passing game more. And he landed in just a great spot with the Colts and their incredible offensive line. So I think he's going to eat in year 1, and I think it's kind of nice that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is being regarded as like the more attractive rookie running back, and I think that has kind of affected Taylor's price and made him just a great 3rd round, early 4th round value.
Absolutely. He's a very interesting one to shout out because a lot of people, it seems to be with Taylor, is like mediocre year 1 prospects, but long term, man, this guy's going to kill it in more of a dynasty leaguer. But you're on the train. This guy is just going to eat right from the first minute he walks in. I mean, I loved watching him play. He was certainly my number 1 ranked running back this year. And I mean, the line, the powerful back, it is just such a beautiful marriage. Would you take him above Helaire even in redraft or dynasty?
I got him 1 spot above Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And,
wow.
I think part of the big reason why people have Edwards-Helaire higher, and in some cases significantly higher, is just the coach speak we've seen after the draft. Like Andy Reid just can't stop talking about Clyde Edwards-Helaire and how he reminds him of Brian Westbrook and how he's going to have a big role right away. That's all great. But like Andy Reid lied his ass off just last year about LaShawn McCoy, veterans maintenance or whatever, and how he was just, we're just basically resting him for a couple of weeks. He'll be back. And, he kind of wasn't back. Like he was being marginalized and shut out of the offense, basically. And it's great that Frank Reich and Chris Ballard want to keep up the morale for Marlon Mack and Naheem Hines, but those guys are not keeping Jonathan Taylor off the field.
I had 2 follow-ups, and one of them was going to be, do you buy the committee talk at all with Mack and Hines? Do you truly think a 3-down roll is going to happen for Taylor? That was going to be, and the kind of second question is, part of that is, are you worried at all about the lack of camps and all that, because of the virus going on? A lot of people are getting a little bit down on rookies and saying the learning curve is going to be a little bit steeper. So I guess a 2-parter there is, are you worried about the committee? You think it's going to be a true 3-down roll? And if so, is that going to be delayed at all? Or when do you think we can anticipate that?
Well, I'll say, first of all, as far as the 3-down roll, we're not going to see a true 3-down roll for Jonathan Taylor. I mean, we see that for so few guys. Jonathan Taylor wasn't even a 3-down back at Wisconsin. I mean, they would take him out on passing downs. My God, otherwise the guy would have gotten 500 touches for the Badgers last year. But, yeah, they had a passing down guy that they used in his absence. And Jonathan Taylor's first year was Dare Agumbawale was their passing down back. So... like in obvious, on 3rd and 6, it's not going to be Jonathan Taylor in there. It's going to be Naheem Hines.
Yeah.
So I don't think Hines's role is going to change very much, but it's Marlon Mack, man. I mean, he's the guy who's going to very much lose out here, and a guy I have no interest in drafting just because I think Taylor is going to zoom by him in terms of usage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, keep going.
Oh, I was just going to get at the second question about rookies in general this year.
Yes.
I think it's more worrisome for the guys who are involved in passing games, the wide receivers and tight ends. It's going to be a little harder for them to sync up, I think, with the, non-conventional training camps, with the, curtailed or eliminated spring programs and team meetings and stuff like that. So it is going to be harder for those guys to get in sync with the quarterback, get in sync with the offense. That kind of thing can take time for pass catchers anyway, and now these guys are kind of set back by it. But, I think running back, it's always easier to make that transition, see the hole, go through the hole, a little less of a learning curve. So I think they're going to be rookie running backs who contribute right away. And, maybe we see it affect the rookie receivers more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's often how it goes anyways, is the running backs tend to translate much quicker just because it's not as much required of you, not as much syncing up and learning of playbooks. So it's a huge point to consider there. I'd say in that similar range of where you're targeting people, I love all the names you shout out. I'm in full agreement that I expect Taylor, even if it's by midseason, especially with Marlon Mack's inconsistent injury history, as soon as he takes that fully, he's going to feast. You're right. He doesn't need to be a full, true 3-down guy, but if he approaches 250 to even 270 touches in this offense behind that line, I mean, good God, the talent, the player, it's going to be phenomenal. So I'm fingers crossed. I'm really hoping it happens sooner than later, because it's just going to be a joy to watch, just as a football fan, but also as a fantasy fan. If he's on your team, I mean, it could be a pure feasting. The guys I like in that kind of third round range where you do have a little more flexibility, you're not as locked into draft slot. Although I would say that the second round, there is kind of a debate as like which guy of these running backs, if I know I'm going running back, do I go? There's kind of like the Drake, the Eklers, it's a little bit tricky in that sense. Why don't we, just before we go on, of those kind of like second round running backs, do you kind of have a preference behind that tier of like the Ekeler, if Sanders fell, the Kenyan Drakes, the Aaron Joneses? Like, do you have a guy you lean on in that second round?
Yeah, Sanders would be my favorite, and he's not, unfortunately, getting to the second round as much lately. Like and I'm a little concerned that I don't think there's any good way to spin the Brandon Brooks Achilles injury for him. Like the Eagles starting right guard just blew out his Achilles, and Brooks was one of the highest graded guards in the league last year, maybe even the highest by PFF. I'm not sure about that, but definitely one of the best. So that's going to hurt, but maybe it'll hurt him a little less because he derives so much of his value from receiving. Right. And it was nice last year, even when he was not looking that great as a runner and maybe was, being kind of tentative with the way he was running on handoffs early last year, and sort of got him relegated to the number 2 ball carrier behind Jordan Howard last year. But at that point, Miles Sanders was still really producing in the passing game. He was running routes downfield, which is exciting for a running back. We don't always see that. It wasn't just little screen passes. And then finally late in the year down the stretch, we saw him take over as the lead runner, and he was still producing in the passing game. I think in the Eagles' last 6 or 7 games, including the playoffs, I think Sanders had at least 5 targets in every game. And when you're catching balls at an 80% rate like he did, averaging about 10 yards a catch, like that's just, when you can bank those 10 PPR points every week, I mean, that's massive. And then, the running yardage is just gravy. So yeah, he has the chance to be really valuable. I like Aaron Jones. Obviously, the touchdown total is going to come down. There's no way he's getting into the high teens again. But, A.J. Dillon seems to be scaring some people off, so Jones has been slipping into the second rounds. I like him. I guess I'm not going to get Kenyan Drake, now that Kenyan Drake has almost become a consensus end of the first round guy. Not so much because I don't like him, although we have still never seen a full Kenyan Drake eats kind of season. Like that still hasn't happened yet. Yeah, things look great in Arizona after the trade, but he's also got 2 really good guys behind him in Chase Edmonds, and then a rookie who I'm not sure why Eno Benjamin fell to the 7th round, but a guy who was pretty electric at Arizona State in college. So I'm just a little worried that there's some interesting competition behind Drake, and it would only take, a sprained ankle to really overturn the depth chart maybe there. So I'm not sure I want to sail into that risk with Drake.
Yeah, I personally am all in on Drake myself, even above, Aaron Jones. You hinted at the TD regression, and I guess I am on that train that he shouldn't lose the goal line role. He was so good at it last year. I mean, led the league in rushing TDs. But A.J. Dillon is that Derrick Henry-sized monster. Like, if he eats in at all, because it was bound to come down no matter what, just natural TD regression. And if he does eat into that total, I mean, so much. I think it ends up being like 36% of his fantasy value was on TDs alone. So I'm slightly nervous, but then there's also the other flip of the coin where it's like, well, it's his last year of his contract. What if they just ride him into the ground? I don't think that will ever happen, but man, if it ever did, if he gets the usage, he's such an exciting player. But with Drake, the one thing I do like is, and it's almost baked into your answer, is he's so good. And if he went down, I mean, Chase Edmonds' price is very cheap, as is Eno Benjamin. So if you just kind of own that backfield, to me, it kind of seemed like throughout the year that offense was based around one guy in the backfield. It's how they operate, not having to substitute, involving the guy in the pass game so they can push the pace. It seemed to me, whether it was David Johnson those first 5 weeks or so, then it was Chase Edmonds for a handful, and then it was Drake. There was always monster running back games happening, and it was mostly because it was one guy there. So even if Drake goes down, I'm hoping to just own that kind of Arizona backfield, whether it's best ball or standard formats, just to kind of lock it in. In terms of the third round, I love the guys you brought up. I'm all in on all of them. The only names I just want to shout out for my personal opinion is I love DJ Moore. I think this offense is going to ignite under Joe Brady with Teddy Bridgewater, who has experience from the Saints, which is where Joe Brady's scheme, all that. I mean, a lot of people already know this if they've listened to the podcast. I'm all in on that offense. I think it's going to light up, and I think that TD total's finally going to rise to match those insane yak that he racks up. It's going to be a beautiful season from him. And I also love Curtis Samuel even later for his price. But I'm trying to get a lot of pieces of that game. And Odell Beckham, I mean, especially for best ball, the way he's falling, I know it's going to be a run-heavy offense, but man, the way Diggs was used on so many vertical routes last year, I think like 70% of his yards or something crazy, the exact ratio I forget, but so much of it was deep yardage. And if this guy is back to full health, it might be one of those kind of players you always have in your heart that won you a fantasy title. I know we all have him. His rookie season, he just carried my lifeless team into a title and won it for me. So I've kind of always been a Beckham guy just at my core. And now the fact that I can get him at the end of round 3 often, and especially in a best ball format, those are the two other guys I just kind of wanted to shout out in addition to your third, fourth kind of turn picks. As we then turn into the mid-round, if you want to comment on either of those guys, feel free as well. Or if you want to just kind of turn your attention to the mid-round and who you're targeting, feel free to just kind of address either.
Oh, sure. And I do like all those mid-round or third-round guys that you mentioned. I've stocked up on DJ Moore. I do not want to not have my fair share of DJ Moore with the Matt Rule and Joe Brady offense. Like that could be a potentially great situation, and Moore showed us what he could become last year. I mean, he was just he was evolving and might be close to fully evolved here, and I think he's absolutely going to be a perennial wide receiver one. Mid-round, so, I mentioned that's kind of the quarterback tight end round for me, and I mentioned guys like TJ Hawkinson and Jonnu Smith, tight ends I like. Quarterbacks that you can get without pushing too hard. I mean, if we're talking like a guy I'm perfectly comfortable going in with as my QB1, this is assuming I'm just hammering wide receiver and running back early, is Jared Goff, actually. And a guy who's typically coming off the board is like the 14th or 15th quarterback. And, do I think Jared Goff is an upper echelon quarterback in the NFL? No, I really don't. But I also think he doesn't completely suck. Maybe some people think he does, but he's got a real sharp play caller in Sean McVay. He's got, ample pass catching talent around him with Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, the 2 tight ends, Everett and Higbee. And he went through a really bad midseason slump where he lost some of his guys last year and, was dealing with some real shaky pass blocking. But towards the end of the season, over the last 5 Rams games, Goff averaged 328 passing yards and had 11 TD passes. So I still think this is an offense that's worth betting on. And, Goff is just really cheap right now. And believe it or not, Wolf, I've actually been kind of attracted to some of the Jets because they're pretty easy to get in the late rounds. Like, I think we're going to get a Sam Darnold breakout fairly soon. There's a guy who could become an upper echelon quarterback. He's got the draft capital behind him. I think his arrival was kind of slowed last year by the fact that he had mononucleosis that, kept him out of some games and surely had him playing at well under 100% in others. I think people just hate Adam Gase, which is driving down the price of Darnold. And, as a guy you can easily pair him with, I think Rashad Perriman is legit. And I don't know, people tend to chase after Jamison Crowder just because he was kind of a target monster last year. But Crowder's never had a 1,000-yard season. He is not a big touchdown scorer. Like, there's just not a lot of upside with Crowder, whereas Perriman was just an absolute monster late last year. And I realized that was because Godwin and Evans were injured. But, it wasn't like Godwin and Evans were both injured for all of the last 5 or 6 Buccaneers games when Perriman was starting to go off. Like, there were a couple games where they were both injured, but sometimes it was just Godwin, sometimes it was just Evans, and Perriman was producing. And, I kind of fully believe in Perriman, and if he can stay healthy, I think he's going to have a nice season for the Jets, and he's cheap.
Absolutely. On the Perriman train, I was writing an article on him yesterday. I haven't published it yet, but it's funny when he was on your list. I've compiled a bunch of stuff on this guy over the last day reading quotes and whatnot, but to illustrate that breakout point again, yes, I get the context behind it, the receivers being out in front of him, but 37 targets, 25 catches, 506 yards, and 5 TDs in 5 games. That's insanity. He was actually the most owned player on championship teams, according to ESPN statistics, where they tell you who were your league winners. It wasn't the full playoffs, although I think he was in there for 15, but I think owners finally trusted him, especially if they had Godwin to carry them, and then they picked him up in the stretch run. And when they put him in week 16, he had another blow-up game. He really didn't have a bad game down that stretch. He called it himself, just a sneak peek of what's to come. There's so many of those efficiency metrics that you were suggesting. One that I like is success on deep passes. He caught 41.7% rate of 20-plus passes, 15 of 36 last year. That was the best rate since 2011, and top 3 among 1,000-yard wideout seasons since 2010. So this guy definitely had those efficiency light bulbs going off. It is, to me, a clear number 2. If anyone is going to evolve into a big X Demaryius Thomas like Gase used to use type of guy, it could be Perriman. So I love that case. I love that player. Even if Darnold, maybe his struggles last year were because of the mononucleosis, it could totally be that. So definitely, I'm liking that one a lot. For late guys, the Goff one's intriguing because the line doesn't look much better. But then you shout out his last few games. That's when they kind of went into that 12 personnel, a lot heavier rate to protect him a little bit longer. It sounds like that's kind of how they're molding the offense. It suggests, when you trade Brandon Cooks away like that, it suggests we might see a whole lot more of that. I liked betting on Sean McVay, even if I don't love Goff. I like betting on McVay, and kind of he seems to be orchestrating a rebuild and figuring out how to cover up some of those weaknesses. So I could totally see that being a sneaky late guy. Even before then, when looking at the middle rounds, right? That's, you talked about you start to hammer wide receivers in 5 through 6. And I want to give some of my late guys in a little bit too, but I do want to make sure we cover those like 5 through 8 before we get to the late round guys that with huge upside. Are there any kind of receivers, or if you go running backs in those mid rounds or tight ends or whatever it might be, is there anybody you find yourself kind of hammering over and over again? Because it is a tough pool of talent. It's still so deep this year that I have a hard time picking out the right guys in those rounds 5 through 6 through 8. Is there anyone that you keep finding yourself getting in those middle rounds?
Oh, yeah. Terry McLaurin keeps finding his way onto my rosters in like the 5th rounds, maybe the 6th round of drafts. A lot of these second-year receivers actually kind of fall into that wheelhouse area. I think I'm a DK Metcalf guy. I just think the upside is pretty irresistible there. Deebo Samuel is the guy who you can get in the 6th. Some of the time his price seems to be going up a little, but I think those are definitely receiver rounds. Sometimes, in the 7th or 8th, I'll bust out a Tyler Higbee because I totally agree with what you said about the enhanced usage of the 12 formation for the Rams and how they're probably going to go that way a lot more this year to help with some of their offensive line problems. So basically I think that is fertile ground for pass catchers.
Absolutely. I love all the ones you shouted out. Those are I love going that sophomore route. There's so many good talents. They already kind of broke out. Like, what if they take it a leap further, especially McLaurin? I mean, I've had 4 or 5, we call them these Wolf segments, and I think every single one of them, whether it's Graham Barfield, Ian Hartitz, every single one of them keeps saying they're targeting Terry McLaurin. So when this type of drum from these quality of analysts keeps getting hit, and it didn't need to be hit for me. I already loved him too. But anybody paying attention that doesn't buy, I get the offense. Washington, not great. Maybe Haskins, not the most intriguing. But let's say this guy does take a next step. All the reports are he's been really actually taking it serious after kind of embarrassing himself as a rookie, not learning the playbook as well as he could have, not really diving all in because he thought he was just going to be a backup. You hate to see that temperament even in the first place, but the fact that he's coming back with the best shape of his career and all those reports, and who knows what's puff and who's not, but even just a mild step forward from him for a guy that's clearly still atop the target totem pole. I mean, I'm all about the McLaurin buzz. The other guy, to build on that Rams train, I love the league-winning upside of Higbee. I mean, that stretch run he had, number 1 tight end in fantasy for those last 6 weeks, I think he was the guy behind Brashad Perriman as the most often on a championship roster. So clearly we've already seen league-winning upside from him. If that carried out for a full season, probably impossible. It was like a 200 target pace, but still, right. Even mildly, he'd be that next kind of Mark Andrews to really be that elite style tight end. I also love Robert Woods in those middle rounds too. I mean, yes, Cooper Kupp, it goes first and blew up and was a top 5 receiver ultimately all said and done. But after that shift, we keep talking about that 12 personnel. I mean, he outpaced Robert Woods, Robert Woods outpaced Cooper Kupp by a pretty significant margin. It was 19.2 fantasy points over those last 7 weeks as compared to about 12 or so for Cooper Kupp. So, I mean, this guy became that alpha that we've often seen him before, and especially in best ball. Yeah, it's a frustrating situation where which receiver, sometimes they both blow up, sometimes it's Higbee. It's a tricky offense because it seems very game plan specific. But again, that nice part about best ball is you don't have to really deal with the headache. You have Robert Woods for his 30-point blow up, and he's automatically in your lineup. You don't have to have the headache of benching him. So he's the other receiver I wanted to make sure to shout out alongside those other names, especially with this Rams list we've been talking about and betting on that offense rebounding. Is there any other either mid-round running backs? As we said, we like to kind of establish our stable, for lack of a better word, of horses early on. Is there any mid-round guys? The one I keep finding myself getting is Kareem Hunt, just because if something happens to Chubb, I mean, he'd be a top 3 weekly guy in that system of Stefanski's, the zone blocking that made Dalvin Cook's a monster on his own, but certainly facilitated an elite season last year. We've seen it over and over again. That zone blocking scheme work wonders for great talents and also no names alike. So a player if either of those guys end up getting the backfield to themselves, they're going to be monsters. I like getting both of them. Obviously, it's tough to justify the price to get both of them. But if I don't get Chubb early, I find myself landing Hunt a lot. Is there any mid-round running back that you feel like you gravitate to, or are you kind of strictly receivers, let's hammer that position away?
No, Hunt's a good one. I also like Tony Pollard for much the same reason, that I think he could, still have some usable weeks even if Ezekiel Elliott stays healthy, because I think Mike McCarthy has liked to use multiple backs. I mean, he had Aaron Jones, and people were saying free Aaron Jones when Mike McCarthy was there. They knew the talent that Aaron Jones had, but he was still using Jamal Williams in equal proportions. I don't think we're going to see Tony Pollard splitting time with Ezekiel Elliott, but I think we're going to see him used in the passing game some. So he might have usable weeks, and if anything happens to Elliott, then obviously he becomes a monster. I like Tevin Coleman simply because I'm not really buying Raheem Mostert. Mostert's, he's an older back. He's in his late 20s. He was undrafted, was not much of a college prospect at all. He's undersized, and he doesn't catch passes. Like, there are a lot of red flags to me on Raheem Mostert. And, I just think Tevin Coleman, not super exciting. I mean, I'm not trying to sell him as like some sort of exceptional talent, but he is fast, and he plays in a terrific offense. And he's going to have at least a seat in the committee. So, I feel like kind of a bet on Tevin Coleman is a little bit of a bet against Raheem Mostert, and I'm happy to put that bet down. And another guy, I think, I mean, he's starting to zoom up in price a little bit, but Alexander Mattison, I guess we probably can't even consider him a mid-round guy anymore, because he's starting to go in like the 6th or 7th round of best balls just because of the threat of a Dalvin Cook holdout.
Right.
But, that's kind of what we're looking for, right? These Yahtzee running backs where they're going to have a role, but, something could conceivably happen where their role suddenly is dramatic hands. So at the floor, they're going to give you some usable weeks, and at the ceiling, they're going to be, big scale tippers.
Absolutely. Those handcuff with benefits in a way,
right.
type of guys. I love loading up my bench with them, especially in best ball formats. Latavius Murray kind of fits that bill. If something happens to Kamara, we saw back-to-back 30-point weeks. The upside in that offense is clearly insane. He's a little more expensive than, say, like a Chase Edmonds, but also that same idea, too, as some other late-round running backs to stockpile those handcuff with benefit style guys. Is there any other, whether late round or so, you highlighted Goff at quarterback. I feel like that's kind of where I start to dip my toes into the quarterback pool, and I love your strategy, 3 of them or so in that range, whether it's Locke, Tannehill, Goff, whether it's, any of those guys, really. Gardner Minshew has some rushing upside. There's just so many of them that could truly take off even in that, late 18 to 25 range. The one I kind of suggested it earlier when I talked about DJ Moore, I find myself just always leaving a draft with Teddy Bridgewater. I just think he's not all that exciting as a player. He gets this game manager label, but when you're surrounded by these type of yak monsters, I mean, McCaffrey, DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, who's been so misused up to this point, they could totally light it up in this type of scheme. And then you still got Robbie Anderson taking the top off. It's not like Teddy can't throw a deep ball. Even if I don't love Teddy, I really think Joe Brady could be the real deal, and I think the weapons around Teddy, I think Teddy's good enough. I like Teddy enough to then buy into the offensive weapons, to buy into the system, and really go all in. Do you like Teddy or any of those other quarterbacks, in addition to Goff, that you kind of find yourself putting into that 3 QB stable?
Yeah, so I am interested in Teddy. It sounds like we're totally on the same page. I don't know if he's anything more than an average quarterback, and maybe even average is a stretch. But, whereas I think it's kind of dangerous sometimes to elevate a quarterback based on the caliber of his weapons. Like, it's hard not to get excited, not only by the weapons, not only by Joe Brady calling the plays, but also by the fact that the Patriots defense was just hot garbage juice last year. And, how much better could it possibly get in one season?
That Division II shootouts, my God.
Exactly, man. I mean, it just seems like there are going to be so many pass-heavy game scripts for the Panthers. It's just like everything is going in Teddy's favor, like every possible circumstance. The only thing that you don't love with Teddy is the pure talent and the fact that he basically doesn't run that much. So, But yeah, as far as how he's set up, like it's hard not to like him, and he's still very affordable in drafts. And really, I can sell myself on a lot of these like low-end QB2s, like Joe Burrow. I mean,
yeah.
I generally don't like investing in rookie quarterbacks, but here's another guy who walks into a really good situation with a lot of talent. Why can't he continue to ride high? Like, obviously, there are going to be some bumps as he goes up to the next level, but he's also a guy who runs a little bit. Like, he had 12 rushing touchdowns in his 2 seasons at LSU and 600? I forget how many rushing yards he had last year, but it was maybe 500 or 600. So, like, he can give you a little extra value there. I kind of like Minshew. I'm not totally sold, but maybe kind of in the same situation I am with Bridgewater, where he's got some intriguing weapons. Yep. He's probably going to be in a lot of pass-heavy game scripts. And, you could even throw in a guy like Kirk Cousins, who gets dumped on just because he's not good in big games. But, what if the assumptions about Minnesota being run-heavy aren't really true? Like, they've lost a lot on the defensive end of the ball. And their cornerbacks in particular were just completely gutted in the offseason. And they're probably going to be playing 2 rookies, Dantzler and Gladney right away at cornerback. So they could be in some more shootouts and be forced to throw a little bit more. And, Cousins might not win win big games, but he is still a pretty efficient and, effective quarterback, at least between the 20s. So, he's not a guy I would mind taking in the 14th round of a best ball.
Absolutely. I love all those names. It seems to be such a clear cut, like a few running backs early, load up on these exciting wide receivers and capitalize on the depth in the middle, 5 through 10, throw in a tight end or 2 while you're there. If you get a Carson Wentz, great. But I mean, rounds 12 through 15, you could get your top 3 quarterbacks, and there's a good case 1 or 2 or even 3 of them will have at least 20 points that week. So in best ball especially, even if I don't have to figure out which one it is and which one to put in from that carousel, all the much better, all the more reason to wait and kind of pick up these exciting prospects that any one of them could light up any given week. So I totally agree on all of those. You've hinted at Raheem Mostert, who I can't say I totally agree with. I'm actually a big Mostert fan, but I do want to get to your kind of avoid list. Is there any other guys in addition to Mostert that you kind of just never leave a draft with or are on your kind of do not draft list, or particularly for best ball?
Well, if you didn't agree with Mostert, Wolf, I think you're really not going to agree with this one either. Looking at your rankings, Keenan Allen is kind of a guy I'm shying away from this year. Like, I'd rather have one of those exciting second-year wide receivers where the ceiling might not have been reached yet. Guys like Metcalf and McLaurin. I think we have hit the ceiling with Allen already, and I'm really worried about just that offense in general with either Tyrod Taylor or Justin Herbert. Herbert's going to have a rocky indoctrination. Here. Tyrod, I know Tyrod was a useful fantasy player for a little while. I mean, I just don't think he's a very good quarterback. I mean, he might have been effective for fantasy for a while, but I just don't think he's a very good passer, and I don't think he can float wide receiver 1 numbers for anyone. Allen's a terrific route runner. He's got good hands. He's a good player. I mean, he's had some bad luck with injuries, but I don't know that I'd go so far as to say that he's injury prone. I just don't think it's a great situation for him this year. And he did have an alarming disappearance last year where he just flat out died for like a month and a half. Yeah. And that was with Phillip Rivers there. And, I'm not sure what happened there, but, we saw that disappearance, and I don't know. I think there are going to be some other pretty empty weeks for him in this offense this year. So not touching him. We mentioned Mostert, and kind of another guy I just don't really like in that maybe 4th round area for running backs or so. James Conner. Like, I'd much rather draft a good wide receiver than James Conner. He's a guy maybe we could talk about being injury prone. I don't think he can hold up as any sort of workhorse back. Plus, they've been adding all these guys behind him. And I don't, I'm not head over heels in love with Benny Snell or Anthony McFarland or Jalen Samuels, but they do have this potpourri of backs with like a multitude of skills. So it would almost seem like they're really pushing this thing towards a committee. And maybe they just realize that James Conner cannot be a 300 touch a season kind of back. So, plus I think maybe other people think there's more talent there than I do with Conner. So he's just a guy I never seem to get because someone always likes him more than I do in a draft.
Yeah, I find myself not leaving with Conner a whole ton just because the point you illustrated, the receivers in that range are just that much more intriguing to me. I do like the comments from Mike Tomlin about the workhorse. I'm a featured runner kind of guy, and I like a guy to establish himself, and the team kind of centers around that, and we've seen that throughout his history, whether it was obviously Le'Veon Bell. I mean, the talent certainly dictates a workhorse role, but we saw it with D'Angelo Williams, even like Stephen Ridley getting 17, 18 touches. So to me, it's more of a matter of with health than anything with Conner, and that's kind of why I avoid it. Is I do think there's unfortunately a little bit of injury proneness, but in terms of sheer opportunities, I mean, his backs, I had a tweet about it not too long ago. It's something around the average, like 20-something opportunities when you combine targets and carries. And the average finish when it's, of his running backs, if you just took D'Angelo Williams' output and you took Le'Veon Bell's in the seasons that, one or the other missed time, and you just kind of do the output of just the team running back, the workhorse starter, they average like a RB3 or so finish in fantasy, and that includes Conner, who we just saw finish as the RB5. So there is upside there with the round 4 price, but I'm with you. I'm not ending up with him all too often. If he does stay healthy, he'll probably be a league changer in my opinion, but that is a huge one to bet on. And Keenan Allen, who you shouted, like I don't know. I'm shocked actually kind of looking at my rankings that he's, I'm as high one on him because again, I think in his range I typically go running back. But I'm looking at mine. I might have to adjust it just a little bit. He's not a guy I'm like going out of my way to get. And by my rankings, it certainly looks like he is. So I don't have like a huge case for him. I just have always loved the things you highlighted. His route running is, his ability with Rivers has always been fantastic. But Tyrod is definitely a guy to be wary of. He had a couple, Sammy Watkins had a couple really nice stretches with Tyrod, but you're right. Like, that might be much more of an overbet on talent because I just always liked Keenan Allen as a player without me kind of being a little blind to what the usage look like in a run heavier offense this year. What might the, surrounding talent downgrade? Is Tyrod going to really tank that? So that's an interesting one to consider. I'll have to go back in and look at Keenan Allen because I'm not sitting here banging the wall. I need Keenan Allen, but my rankings come plus 11 ECR right now in his wide receiver rank, and clearly it looks that way. So I'm glad you pointed that one out for me. At this point, we've covered best ball. I had a couple other questions written down, but we've been going quite long. So I just want to pump that you've been appearing on Fantasy Pros a couple times. You highlighted DK Metcalf and David Johnson as league-winning potential outside of the top 20 at their positions. So, very interesting take on Fantasy Pros, just a cool article in general of expert consensus weighing in on outside of top 20 guys who could be league winners. So you had DK and David Johnson in that. And you also have an awesome article on the Football Girl about Tom Brady, and it's titled, Will Brady Fall from a Cliff in 2020? So if you want to know why Pat's so into those guys, check out those articles. And if you think if you're worried about Brady falling off a cliff, check out that article as well on the Football Girl. It's a very in-depth, fantastic piece. But I know we've been running, and I'd love to have you. If you have the time, great. If not, totally fine. You've been so generous by answering all these questions in so much depth. But we do love to have what we call the no-huddle offense, which is just like a quick gut reaction to about 20 questions. Do you have the time to run through that with me real quick, Pat?
I absolutely do, and I can give you the Metcalf, David Johnson, and Brady takes in less than a minute.
Let's hear them. Even better.
David Johnson was sort of a caveat. He's not a guy I'm chasing, but they made you pick guys who are had an ECR outside the top 20. David Johnson just has the role. He's set for volume in a good offense triggered by Deshaun Watson. And as much early round draft capital as David Johnson has torpedoed the last 3 years. I mean, if he's got anything left in the tank, he could certainly be a top 10 or top 15 guy this year. DK Metcalf, at his current price, if he has a repeat of his rookie season where he has 900 yards and 7 touchdowns, he's not going to kill you.
Right.
But with his size and speed and some of the holy crap catches we saw him make late last season, like, there's potential Randy Moss upside here. Like, I'm not saying he's going to be the next Randy Moss, but there is vast upside here. And if he taps into that this year, I mean, he could turn a big profit on a 4th or 5th round pick. And Tom Brady, it was sort of a mixed conclusion on him. On one hand, I think there are legitimate reasons for concern about a guy who's going to be going in his age 43 season at quarterback. I mean, literally the only other quarterback who has started games at age 43 in the post-merger era is Vinny Testaverde. And just a handful of guys who played at that age: Vinny Testaverde, Doug Flutie, Steve DeBerg, maybe Warren Moon. So it's a very short list, and those guys were, like, not putting up good numbers in their appearances. And, like, we already saw some kind of dangerous yards per attempt slippage with Brady, like the kind of drop off you start to say, uh-oh. And yes, we can make the excuse that he didn't have a great collection of pass catchers last year, and now all of a sudden he's got Evans, Godwin, all this talent around him. So I like the talent. I like that he's paired with Bruce Arians, and I like that, you know, we're not talking about Vinny Testaverde. We're talking about Tom Brady. Like, he's reached heights that, you know, Testaverde and Flutie and these other guys didn't. So kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I'm not being super aggressive on a 43-year-old quarterback. You know, there is definitely the risk that he goes over that age cliff and there's no coming back. But, you know, still, of course, a great quarterback paired with that kind of weaponry. It's attractive. I'm just sort of torn here. It's a kind of a balancing act, and I don't know which way we're going to go here.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents, I'm a Patriots homer. I'm up in the Boston area, so I'm always going to be willing to bet on Brady no matter what happens. Obviously, my heart was ripped out when he left, but ultimately I can swallow that and still go back to the fantasy well. I think all the positives you highlighted, the weapons, Bruce Arians, I mean, we saw a late career Carson Palmer light it up for top 6 QBs. They've consistently ranked in the top 1 to 2 air yards per year under Arians, whatever offense he's been with, whether it was Pittsburgh, whether it was Arizona, whether it was the year in Indy with Andrew Luck. He always just airs it out, which, you know, is that Brady's strength at this point? Who knows? He still threw a decent, according to PFF, he was in the top 10 of their deep ball metrics in many categories. So if he can still get the rock to those guys, and I think Brady still has enough, I mean, it's going to be a beauty season. If Jameis Winston can do what he did, yeah, the guy's got a stronger arm and more willingness to let it just fly. So I don't know if we'll get quite the passing yardage leader, but less interceptions. I think definitely 4,500 yards is certainly attainable within this offense with those weapons. So if you cut down the interceptions and he still tosses 27 to 35 TDs in 4,500 yards, it's going to be well worth the value. So I'm all in on Brady again. Obviously some homer bias there. David Johnson, to touch on all of those guys real quick, I was burned too badly last year, and a couple years in a row I had him in 2016. I've kept going back to the well, and he's kept disappointing me. So he's on my do not draft list just out of personal spite. I get all the beautiful setup. The case is there. So, of course, everyone listening should draft him because this is going to be the one year he does rebound and go crazy. It seems like that always happens when you finally jump off a train. They always go off and just spite you one last time. So draft him if you want, if you believe in that type of luck stuff. I'm not taking him at all, but I love the DK Metcalf. I mean, the way he just took over a playoff game as a rookie, literally was the best player on the field and was unstoppable. You could not guard him in that game. And if we ever, for the love of God, get a Russell Wilson season where he's just unleashed, I think he might be the best, definitely top 3 in my opinion, quarterback in the league. He just keeps getting shackled by these Schottenheimer run-heavy schemes. But if they ever just wake up and unleash this guy, and you got Lockett and Metcalf, I mean, we could just have an aerial bonanza. I don't think we get it because of so much history. But if we did, I mean, the ceiling would be the Randy Moss, as you suggest. It's not out of the question here, which is insane to even say about a player, but we saw those types of plays and catches. Holy hell. I mean, it could be insane if they ever just unshackled him. So love all those takes. I didn't mean to rush it either. I'll stay talk football with you all day. I looked at the clock. I was like, holy shit, it's already been, over an hour. I thought we were talking for 25 minutes at this point because it's been a blast. I don't know if you have any others you want to throw out there, or you want to get to this, the no huddle offense with me.
Yeah, I'm not always good at the 2-minute drill. So I probably didn't, work the no huddle offense as well as I could have, but hey, let's go through it. Maybe I only have 43 seconds. No, I'll rip through these fast. Do quicker answers. I've been rambling a little bit, but I absolutely want to
stay as long as you have. I'll talk football with you all day, my man. This has been incredible just to be able to pick your brain and hear your takes. And again, this is Pat Fitzmaurice. And want to just, before we hit the no huddle offense, just plug your stuff one more time to make sure our listeners know where they can find you.
Oh, sure. You can find me on Twitter at Fitz_FF. Look for the Fitz on Fantasy podcast and check out my content, my rankings at thefootballgirl.com.
Alrighty. And so we're going to line it up here. You're only expected to give kind of the gut reaction here. Of course, if there's some you want to expand on, I'm not going to ever cut you off. Your insight's been invaluable so far today. So feel free to expand on any that move you. But ultimately, just give, what gut reaction comes to mind. You ready to roll?
Let's do it, my man.
Alrighty. So after Christian McCaffrey, the number 2 player in fantasy should be
Saquon Barkley.
The next Dalvin Cook or round 2 running back who's top 5 in 2021 will be
Jonathan Taylor.
Ooh, love it. Favorite fantasy team name that you've either had or you've seen someone else have?
Oh, man. No good ones in my leagues, but the one that's pretty clever is Country Road Take Mahomes.
I like it. Love it. The next Chris Godwin or round 4 to 5 wide receiver who explodes into the elite will be
Terry McLaurin. All set up for him this year.
Awesome. You're not the first one to say that, too. He's been a very popular answer for that. 2020's Mark Andrews or the breakout tight end will be
some interesting candidates here. I'll go TJ Hawkinson. I think his injuries kind of obscured his first season, both the injuries to him and the injuries to Matt Stafford. So I think there's breakout potential this year.
Most hated NFL player for fantasy-specific reasons is?
Now, just to be clear, I don't hate on any of these guys, but the guy who has killed me the most over the last decade or so, without question, Cam Newton. If I'm going against Cam Newton, he goes off on me without fail every time.
Love that one. If there was somehow another Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes, it would be
Kyler Murray.
Mm-hmm. Which early rounder, 1 or 2, is going to bust the hardest?
Oh, we talked about this earlier. I don't think anyone's an obvious bust candidate, but I'm a little worried about Kenyan Drake.
Who gained the most fantasy value in the 2020 offseason?
Probably David Johnson. David Johnson.
Conversely, who lost the most?
How about a tie between Mark Ingram and Darrell Henderson? 2 guys who were poised to be RB1s and are now looking like RB2s. Or at best, committee members.
I won't leave rounds 5 to 6 without
either McLaurin or DK Metcalf.
This is random, but do you play Settlers of Catan ever?
I do not. I do not. We've been meaning to get into that with our kids, and we have not played it yet.
Highly recommended. I think it would be. I got it from my nephews, and we play all the time. He loves it. Highly recommended. If you've been considering it, I'm addicted to it, which is why I asked this question. The next sophomore wide receiver after, or if you have him even before A.J. Brown, should be.
So got to stay true to the earlier answers. DK Metcalf and Terry McLaurin.
Target hogs or workhorse backs?
Got to go workhorse backs. They're an endangered species at this point.
Alvin Kamara, James Conner, Austin Ekeler, all were top 5 running backs after round 7. In 2020, that will be?
Oh, man, round 7 or later. Darius Geis.
What is your ideal league settings?
Oh, so as much as I love Superflex, I'm going to go with the league I am the commissioner of. 16 teams, single quarterback, deep draft, 22 rounds, and we have for touchdowns, we are a standard league. There's no PPR scoring, no half PPR. It's just standard, but we only have 2 points for a passing touchdown and 4 for a rushing or receiving touchdown. That is my favorite format. I think that is the perfect league.
Very interesting. I haven't heard that one before. I love it. After Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams, owners should draft blank at wide receiver.
Oh, after Devontae, too. Who is my number 3? I think is it still Julio? I think it's still Julio.
Blank was the most important coaching move for fantasy, and that's specifically for which player's value?
We talked about it, Wolf. Matt Rule and Joe Brady elevating Teddy Bridgewater into viable starting quarterback territory for fantasy purposes.
Love it. Do running backs matter?
Yes, they do.
What is the funniest last place punishment or side bet that you've either witnessed or unfortunately been a part of?
Yeah, so we don't really do the last place punishments, but there are 2 guys in the league I run, that 16-team league I was just talking about, where their game every year, they bet a bottle or a glass of expensive bourbon at the following year's draft. It's an in-person draft. And it's not only that glass of bourbon for the winner of the bet, but also for the commissioner. So I get to be part of this and enjoy the loser's pain every year. So that is by far my favorite punishment.
Definitely some vested stake in that. I love it. And last but not least, what is your boldest 2020 fantasy prediction? And just one more reminder of where our listeners can connect and find your work.
I'll say that Jonathan Taylor leads the NFL in rushing yards as a rookie. And you can find me at Fitz_FF on Twitter, and my written content rankings at footballgirl.com. And please look for my podcast, Fitz on Fantasy. It's on most podcast platforms.
Awesome. Pat, thanks so much for your generosity and time. Again, I truly was like, we've only been talking for a half hour. I looked and it was like an hour and 10. So I hope I didn't interfere with anything in your day. You've been incredible to have on as a guest. And again, recommend any of my listeners, please make sure you check out his work and interact. He's fantastic. So Pat, thanks so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Wolf. Time does fly when you're having fun, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. So awesome. I appreciate the invitation, and hope you have a great summer away from teaching for a while.
I appreciate that very much, my man. You have a great summer as well. Take care.
You too, buddy.